The silent black grave digger speaks out about racism and leaves mourners in tears. The cemetery lay quiet in the early morning light, shrouded in a thin mist that clung to the grass like a memory refusing to let go. Rows of headstones stretched as far as the eye could see, each one bearing a name, a date, a story. And among them stood James Walker, a figure as steady and timeless as the land itself. His hands, calloused from decades of labor, gripped the handle of his shovel as he prepared the earth for another soul's final resting place. James had worked here for over 40 years, quietly digging graves, tending to the dead, and witnessing the endless cycle of grief. He wasn't a man of many words. He didn't need to be. His actions, his care in his work, spoke louder than any eulogy ever could. But behind his silence lay a lifetime of stories of resilience, of pain, and of a quiet dignity forged in the fire of systemic racism. As he dug, his mind wandered back to his childhood in the rural South. James had grown up in a world where he was taught from an early age to stay in his place. Signs told him where he could drink water, where he could sit, where he could walk. The weight of those restrictions was something he carried with him every day, even now, decades later. But it wasn't just the past that haunted him. Racism had followed him into adulthood, sometimes subtle, sometimes blatant, but always there. When he started working as a gravedigger, he thought he had found a quiet corner of the world where he could simply do his job without being judged. But even in death, he couldn't escape it. He saw the way white families avoided him at funerals, their discomfort evident in their sidelong glances and whispered comments. He heard the snide remarks from funeral directors telling him to stay out of sight during services so as not to upset the mourners. James endured it all with a stoic grace, but it left its mark. Over time, he began to feel as though he too was becoming invisible. He was the man in the shadows, the one no one noticed, no one thanked, no one acknowledged. It was a feeling he'd grown used to, though it never stopped stinging. One day, as he prepared a grave for an upcoming service, he paused to wipe the sweat from his brow. A group of mourners walked by, their faces etched with grief. They didn't see him. They never did. He watched as they laid flowers at a nearby grave, their tears falling onto the petals. He understood their pain. It was a pain he had seen thousands of times before. But what struck him in that moment was the realization that, when his time came, there might not be anyone to grieve for him. James shook off the thought and returned to his work. He had long since accepted that his life was one of quiet service, a life lived in the background. But something about that day stayed with him. It wasn't just the families who ignored him. It was the system that had rendered him invisible, the society that had taught people like him to shrink themselves, to remain silent, to go unnoticed. For James, silence had become a way of life. He had learned that speaking up often came with consequences, that the world wasn't always ready to hear the truths he carried. But deep down, he knew those truths needed to be told. And as he stood there in the quiet cemetery, surrounded by the lives he had helped lay to rest, he wondered if perhaps it was time to break his silence. James didn't know it yet, but his story was about to take a turn. He was about to find his voice in a way he never expected, and when he did, it would leave an impact far greater than he could have imagined. If you're watching this, you're already part of something bigger, a community that believes in justice, in truth, and in the power of sharing untold stories. Subscribing to this channel means joining a movement, a family of people who care about voices like James's, who believe that no one should feel invisible. Stay with us, because this story is just beginning. The cemetery office was quiet as James stood by the window, listening to the funeral director give his usual instructions. It was another routine day for James, another grave to prepare, another family to watch from a distance as they said their goodbyes. He had done this for so long that the motions felt automatic, almost detached. But inside, James carried the weight of every shovel of dirt, every tear he had witnessed, every name etched into a headstone. That afternoon, he was assigned to prepare a grave for Evelyn Carter. The name stirred something in him. Evelyn wasn't just another person being laid to rest. She was a force of nature in the Black community. A teacher, an activist, a voice that had inspired change in the lives of countless people. James had heard her name many times over the years, spoken with reverence and respect. Now, he would be part of her final farewell. As James dug, his mind wandered. He thought about how different Evelyn's life had been from his own. While she had stood in front of crowds, speaking truth to power, he had worked quietly in the background, unseen and unheard. Yet, in some ways, they had walked the same path. Both had faced the same struggles, the same injustices, the same weight of being Black in a world that often refused to see their worth. When the funeral began, James stayed at a respectful distance, leaning on his shovel as he watched the mourners gather. The eulogies were powerful, each one painting a vivid picture of Evelyn's life. One speaker described how she'd marched in protests, her voice ringing out over chants and slogans, calling for equality and justice. Another shared stories of how she had mentored young students, encouraging them to believe in themselves and to fight for their dreams. James listened intently, his heart heavy but full of admiration. He couldn't help but think about the stark contrast between Evelyn's life and his own. While she had been a leader, a beacon of hope, he had been a silent observer watching the world from the shadows. But as he stood there, listening to the stories of her courage and resilience, something inside him began to stir. When the service ended and the mourners began to disperse, James lingered by the edge of the gathering, his shovel resting against the ground. For years, he had stayed silent, keeping his thoughts and feelings buried like the graves he tended. But today felt different. Today, the silence felt too heavy to carry. As the last mourner turned to leave, James took a deep breath and stepped forward. His hands trembled slightly as he cleared his throat. The few people still gathered turned to look at him, their faces a mix of surprise and curiosity. James had never spoken at a service before. He wasn't even sure what he was going to say, but he knew he couldn't let the moment pass. He looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, others new, all waiting for him to speak. For the first time, James felt the weight of their expectation, not as a burden, but as a gift. "I've been digging graves for over 40 years, he began, his voice low but steady. "I've buried people from all walks of life, rich, poor, young, old. And every time, I've wondered what their lives were like, what kind of stories they left behind." He paused, looking down at the freshly turned earth beneath his feet. "But listening to all of you today, hearing about Ms. Carter, it reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that even when the world tries to silence us, our stories still matter. Our lives still matter." The small group stood in stunned silence, their eyes fixed on James. He spoke slowly, deliberately, his words carrying the weight of decades of unspoken pain and reflection. "I've spent most of my life in the background," he said, "watching, working, staying quiet, because that's what the world expected of me. But today, I see that silence isn't enough. Ms. Carter didn't stay silent. And because of her, so many people found their voices. Maybe it's time for me to find mine. As James finished speaking, one of the mourners, an older woman, stepped forward and took his hand. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes filled with tears. "You've been carrying so much for so long. It's time we started listening." James nodded, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he felt truly seen, not just as a gravedigger, but as a person, a man with his own story to tell. And as he stood there, surrounded by the echoes of Evelyn's legacy, he realized that her fight wasn't over. It had simply passed into the hands of those she had inspired, including him. That night, as James walked home, he thought about the graves he had dug, the people he had buried, and the lives he had quietly witnessed. He thought about the pain he had carried, the racism he had endured, and the moments of dignity he had fought to preserve. And for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose beyond the work he had done for so many years. Evelyn's story had reminded him that even the quietest voices could make a difference. And as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, James resolved to start sharing his own story. Not just for himself, but for the generations to come. Because if there was one thing Evelyn had taught him, it was that every story matters, no matter how long it takes to be told. The following day, James returned to the cemetery with a heaviness in his chest, but also a strange sense of anticipation. The words he had spoken at Evelyn Carter's funeral lingered in his mind. He replayed them over and over, wondering if he had said too much, or perhaps not enough. For so many years, he had worked in silence, letting the sound of his shovel hitting the earth speak for him. But now, it felt as though something inside him had cracked open, letting the light shine into places he had long hidden away. As he dug another grave that morning, his thoughts turned to the mourners at Evelyn's service. He thought about the way they had looked at him, not with pity or condescension, but with respect. It was a rare feeling for James, and it unsettled him in ways he didn't fully understand. For decades, he had taught himself to expect nothing from the world, to accept the role it had assigned him. But now, he wondered if perhaps there was more he could do, more he could be. Later that afternoon, as James prepared for another service, he overheard two funeral directors talking in hushed tones near the office. They were discussing Evelyn's funeral, the large turnout, and how unusual it was for someone of her background to have such an impact. "She really shook things up, didn't she?" one of them said, his voice tinged with something James couldn't quite place. Disdain, perhaps, or maybe just ignorance. "Well, people like that always make a lot of noise," the other replied. "But in the end, things go back to the way they were. They always do." James felt a familiar heat rise in his chest, the kind that came from years of enduring comments like this. He clenched his fists, the rough leather of his gloves biting into his palms. He wanted to say something, to call them out, but the fear of confrontation held him back. Instead, he turned and walked away, his mind racing. Was this what Evelyn had fought against her whole life? The quiet, insidious nature of prejudice, the way it slipped into conversations and shaped the world without anyone even noticing. He realized then that silence wasn't just a shield, it was a prison, and he was tired of being locked inside. That evening, James sat in his small kitchen, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. He thought about the years he had spent in the cemetery, about the countless graves he had dug, each one a silent witness to the lives and stories of others. He thought about the families who had come to grieve, some of whom had barely noticed him, and others who had treated him as though his presence was an intrusion. He thought about the racism he had endured, how it had chipped away at his spirit, leaving cracks he had tried to fill with stoicism and hard work. But now, those cracks felt like openings, places where light could pour in if he let it. The next day, James decided to act. He began speaking quietly to other cemetery workers, asking if they had noticed the same disparities he had, how the graves of black families were often neglected, how the staff seemed to prioritize wealthier white families, how certain mourners avoided them entirely. At first, the others were hesitant to talk, their voices low and wary. But as James shared his own experiences, their stories began to spill out. One worker, a young man named Andre, described how he had been reprimanded for standing too close to a white family's service, even though he was just doing his job. Another, an older woman named Maria, talked about how she had been assigned to clean headstones only in the less visible parts of the cemetery. The more they talked, the clearer the pattern became. It wasn't just James, it was all of them. They were part of a system that treated them as lesser, that erased their contributions while pretending to honor the dead. And for the first time, James realized that he wasn't alone in his frustration. As the days went on, James began to notice something else, a shift in how the mourners treated him. At one service, a middle-aged black man approached him after the burial and shook his hand. "Thank you for what you do," the man said, his voice filled with sincerity. "It means more than you know." At another service, a young woman handed him a flower as she left, her eyes glistening with tears. "My grandmother always said people like you keep the world turning," she said. I think she was right. These small gestures, so unexpected, filled James with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. For so long, he had believed that his work didn't matter, that he was invisible. But now, he began to see that his role was more than just digging graves. It was about honoring lives, about creating a space where stories could be remembered and legacies preserved. Then came the service that changed everything. It was for a woman named Clara Johnson, an elder in the black community who had been a friend of Evelyn Carter's. The funeral was smaller than Evelyn's, but no less powerful. As James stood at the edge of the gathering, he noticed a familiar face among the mourners. A man who had been at Evelyn's funeral and had listened to James's impromptu speech. After the service, the man approached James with a warm smile. "You don't know me," he said, extending his hand, "but I was moved by what you said at Ms. Carter's funeral. You have a way of speaking that reaches people. Have you ever thought about sharing your story more widely?" James hesitated, the weight of the man's words settling over him. "I'm just a grave digger," he said quietly. "I don't think people want to hear from someone like me." The man shook his head. "You're more than that," he said firmly. "You've seen things most people don't. You've carried stories that deserve to be told. Don't underestimate the power of your voice." James didn't respond right away, but the man's words stayed with him as he walked home that evening. For years, he had buried not just bodies, but his own pain, his own experiences, his own truth. But maybe it was time to dig something up for a change. Maybe it was time to let the world see what he had carried all these years. That night, James sat down at his small table and began to write. He didn't know where the words would lead him, but for the first time, he felt ready to speak. And in that moment, he realized that silence was no longer an option. James found himself standing at a podium for the first time in his life. The room was packed, filled with members of the community who had gathered for a memorial honoring both Evelyn Carter and Clara Johnson. He had been invited to speak not because he was famous, not because he held any particular title, but because his story had touched people in ways he never could have imagined. He looked out at the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent his entire life in the background, a silent witness to the lives and deaths of others. But today, all eyes were on him. He gripped the edges of the podium, his rough hands trembling slightly, and took a deep breath. "I'm not used to speaking in front of people," he began, his voice steady but quiet. "I've spent most of my life digging graves, standing in the shadows while others grieved. For a long time, I thought that was where I belonged, in the background, unseen, unheard. But today, I realize that silence isn't the same as peace." The room was so quiet that you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. James looked down for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "I've been working at the cemetery for over 40 years, he continued. "In that time, I've buried thousands of people, rich, poor, young, old, black, white. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that death doesn't discriminate. But life often does." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I've seen the way people treat graves differently, depending on who's buried there. I've seen how families like mine, black families, often can't afford the marble headstones or the fresh flowers. I've seen how some mourners act like people like me don't belong in the spaces where grief is shared. And for a long time, I accepted that. I thought it was just the way things were." James's voice grew stronger as he continued. "But then I heard the stories of Evelyn Carter and Clara Johnson, women who fought, not just for themselves, but for everyone who came after them. Women who refused to let the world tell them they were less than. And I realized something. Their fight didn't end with them. It's a fight we all have to keep carrying forward." The crowd began to nod, their faces a mixture of sadness and hope. James felt the tension in his chest ease slightly. He wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for all the people who had been silenced, ignored, or forgotten. "I want you to know something," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Your stories matter. Your lives matter. And no matter how invisible you feel, you are seen, you are heard, and you are loved." At the back of the room, someone began to clap, and soon the entire audience joined in. James felt a lump rise in his throat as he stepped away from the podium, the sound of applause washing over him like a wave. For the first time in his life, he felt like he truly belonged. In the days and weeks that followed, James's story spread far beyond his small community. Local newspapers ran articles about his speech, and soon he was invited to speak at other events. People began reaching out to him, sharing their own experiences of feeling invisible or forgotten. Some were gravediggers like him, others were nurses, janitors, teachers, people who worked quietly in the background, their contributions often overlooked. James found himself at the center of a growing movement. He worked with community leaders to create initiatives aimed at honoring the lives and stories of those who had been marginalized. Together, they started a project to restore neglected graves in the cemetery, ensuring that every person, regardless of their background, was remembered with dignity. The cemetery itself began to change. Mourners who had once ignored James now stopped to thank him, to ask about his life, to acknowledge his work. His fellow employees, inspired by his courage, began speaking out about the inequalities they had witnessed. Slowly but surely, the culture of the cemetery transformed into one of respect and inclusion. James's message reached even further online, where videos of his speeches were shared by thousands. People of all ages and backgrounds resonated with his story, finding in it a reminder of their own worth and the importance of lifting each other up. And it wasn't just about James anymore. His story had sparked a broader conversation about racism, classism, and the quiet ways in which people are made to feel small. It reminded people that everyone, no matter how humble their role, has a story worth telling and a life worth honoring. As James sat in his modest home one evening, reflecting on how much his life had changed, he thought about the graves he had dug and the lives they represented. He thought about Evelyn Carter and Clara Johnson, and how their courage had inspired him to find his voice. And he thought about the future, about the generations who would come after him, living in a world he had helped to change. This isn't just a story about James Walker. It's a story about all of us, about the power of listening, of sharing, and of standing together. It's a reminder that no matter how invisible you feel, you are part of something bigger. Every voice matters. Every life matters. And together, we can create a world where no one is forgotten, no one is ignored, and no one is left in the shadows. James's journey teaches us that it's never too late to speak out, to make a difference, and to remind others of their worth. James's story is a call to each of us to look around, to listen, and to uplift those who feel unseen. Together, we can create a world where every life, no matter how quiet, shines with dignity. Let his story inspire you to take action in your own life, to uplift and to create a community where everyone feels valued. Together, we can build a world where silence is broken, stories are told, and every person is celebrated for the unique light they bring to the world.